When King Saul disobeyed God's instructions, the Lord told the prophet Samuel he was sorry he had made Saul king. Saul lied to Samuel, insisting he had done as God had asked. Samuel told Saul,
"As you have rejected God's command, he has rejected you as king."
Samuel went away and never met with Saul again. But who will be the next king of Israel? The prophet Samuel was very sad that God had rejected Saul as king. God then told Samuel his plan for the future.
"Get some olive oil and go to Bethlehem to a man named Jesse, because I have chosen one of his sons to be king."
"How can I do that?"
Samuel asked.
"If Saul hears about it, he will kill me."
The Lord replied,
"Take a calf with you and say that you are there to offer a sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will tell you the man I have chosen as king."
Samuel obeyed. At the sacrifice, Samuel saw Jesse's son Eliab and thought,
"This man standing must be one God has chosen."
But the Lord said to him,
"Pay no attention to how tall and handsome he is. I have rejected him, because I do not judge as people judge. They look at the outward appearance, but I look at the heart."
Then Jesse called his next oldest son Abinadab, but Samuel said,
"No, the Lord hasn't chosen him either."
Jesse then brought Shammah.
"No, the Lord hasn't chosen him either,"
said Samuel. One by one, Jesse brought 7 of his sons to Samuel. But Samuel said to him,
"No, the Lord hasn't chosen any of these."
The prophet Samuel asked Jesse,
"Do you have any more sons?"
Jesse answered,
"There is the youngest, David, but he is out taking care of the sheep."
"Tell him to come here."
Samuel said,
"We won't offer the sacrifice until he comes."
So Jesse sent for him. He was a handsome, healthy young man, and his eyes sparkled. The Lord said to Samuel,
"This is the one, anoint him."
Samuel took the olive oil and anointed David in front of his brothers. Immediately the Spirit of the Lord took control of David and was with him from that day on. Meanwhile King Saul was being tormented by evil and in a bad mood. His servants said,
"Jesse has a son, who plays the harp.
He is a good musician and Lord is with him. When you are tormented, let him play his harp and you will be all right again."
David served King Saul by playing his harp when the king was tormented by evil. Saul, at first, liked him very much and chose him as the man to carry his weapons. As a young boy, how find David himself in the middle of a battle? Let's see the details. The Philistines gathered for battle against the Israelites. The Philistines lined up on one hill and the Israelites on another, with a valley between them. King Saul and the Israelites were camped in Elah Valley. A man named Goliath, from the city of Gath, came out from the Philistine camp to challenge the Israelites. Goliath was over 7 feet tall and wore bronze armor that weighed about 125 pounds. His legs were also protected by bronze armor, and he carried a bronze javelin. The iron head on his spear weighed about 15 pounds. A soldier walked in front of him carrying his shield. Goliath shouted at the Israelites,
"Choose one of your men to fight me. If he wins and kills me, we will be your slaves, but if I win and kill him, you will be our slaves. I dare you to pick someone to fight me."
Saul and his men were terrified. David was back in Bethlehem looking after his father's sheep. He often had to protect the sheep from attacks by lions and bears. His 3 oldest brothers Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah were in the army facing the Philistines. Goliath challenged the Israelites every morning and evening for 40 days. One day Jesse said to David,
"Take this roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread to your brothers in the camp. And take these 10 cheeses to the commanding officer. Find out how your brothers are getting along."
David took the food to the officer in charge of the supplies, then ran to the battle line to see his brothers. As he was talking with them, Goliath came forward and challenged the Israelites. When the Israelites saw Goliath, they ran away in terror. David asked,
"Who is this Philistine to defy the army of the living God?"
They told him the man who killed Goliath would get a big reward, marry the king's daughter, and his father's family would not need to pay taxes. David was taken to King Saul.
"Your Majesty,"
said David,
"no one should be afraid of this Philistine. I will go and fight him."
"No," answered Saul. "How could you fight him? You're just a boy, and he has been a soldier all his life."
"I have killed lions and bears who attacked my father's sheep,"
replied David.
And I will do the same to this Philistine, who has defied the army of the living God. The Lord will save me from Goliath.
Go, and the Lord be with you. Saul replied. He gave David his armor, but when David tried it on, he said,
I can't fight with all this, I'm not used to it.
Instead, he took his shepherd's stick and then picked up 5 smooth stones from the stream and put them in his bag. With his sling ready, he went out to meet Goliath. Goliath started walking toward David, with his shield-bearer walking in front of him.
What's that stick for?
He shouted at David.
Do you think I'm a dog?
Goliath called down curses from his god on David.
Come on, I will give your body to the birds and animals to eat.
He shouted. David answered.
You are coming against me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty. Today the Lord will put you in my power. I will defeat you and cut off your head.
As Goliath started walking toward David again, David ran quickly toward the Philistine. He reached into his bag and took out a stone, which he slung at Goliath. It hit him on the forehead, breaking his skull, and Goliath fell face downward on the ground. David took Goliath's sword out of its sheath, and cut off his head. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they ran away. The men of Israelites shouted and ran after them, pursuing them all the way to Gath and Ekron in Philistine territory. David kept Goliath's weapons and returned in triumph as a hero. Why was meaningful friendship between the son of King Saul, namely Jonathan, and David, who later became a king after Saul? Let's see what was behind the scenes. The Bible in Living English tells us what happened.
And the spirit of Jehovah had gone away from Saul, and a bad spirit from Jehovah used to overwhelm him. And Saul's officers said to him,
There is a bad divine spirit overwhelming you. Say the word, sir. Your servants are before you. Have them look up a man expert as a lyre player, and when there is a bad divine spirit on you, he shall play his music and you will be better.
And Saul said to his officers,
Pick me out a man who plays well and bring him to me.
And one of the henchmen answered,
I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite who is expert at playing, and a man of energy and a fighter, and discreet in word, and a fine figure, and Jehovah is with him.
And Saul sent messengers to Jesse, and said,
Send me your son David, the one who is with the sheep.
And Jesse took a load of bread and a bag of wine and 1 kid and sent them to Saul by his son David. And David came to Saul and presented himself before him, and Saul took a great liking to him and had him as squire. And Saul sent word to Jesse,
Let David be in my service, because I like him.
And when there was a divine spirit on Saul, David would take his lyre and play his music, and Saul would be easier and better, and the bad spirit would go away from him.
Jonathan's special friendship with David dates from soon after he killed Goliath. That fearless act in defense of Jehovah's people must have particularly moved Jonathan. Hearing David's account of it, Jonathan's very soul became bound up with the soul of David, and Jonathan began to love him as his own soul. The 2 courageous warriors and devoted servants of God proceeded to conclude a covenant of friendship. Jonathan could see that David had God's spirit. He did not jealously view him as a rival, as did Saul.
And on the next day a bad divine spirit seized upon Saul, and he fell under the power in the house, while David was playing his music as he did on any day, and Saul had a spear in his hand. And Saul hurled the spear and thought,
I will pin David to the wall.
But David dodged away from him, twice. And Saul was afraid of David, because Jehovah was with him and had gone away from Saul. After that Saul appointed David as the leader of more than 1,000 warriors in order to have him murdered in battle. However, David was successful in battle because God was with him, and this increased David's popularity. But Saul was delighted to learn that Michal, his daughter, was now in love with David. Why? That was in his mind.
I will give her to him and have her be a bait to trap him, and the hands of the Philistines come on him.
So he promised if David killed 100 Philistines, Saul would give his daughter Michal in marriage. David accepted the challenge despite not considering himself deserving to be the king's son-in-law. Saul had hoped that David would be killed by the Philistines, but instead he came back triumphant and married Michal. David frightened Saul because he knew Jehovah God was with him.
Jonathan, the son of King Saul, had become to be a close friend of David and had given him his belt, sword, and bow. They promised to keep their friendship going. Jonathan was instructed by Saul to kill David, but he kept his word and warned David that his life was in danger instead of assaulting. He then praised David in front of Saul and got the king to swear not to hurt David. Another time, when David was playing his lyre for King Saul after another triumph over the Philistines. The king, in his anger, flung his spear at David, but David ducked out of the way. David escaped his house after the spear struck the wall. Saul assigned men to David's home to keep an eye on it and then assassinate him the next morning. And David's wife Michal told him,
"If you do not get your life into safety tonight, you will be put to death tomorrow."
And Michal let David down through the window, and off he went, and fled away and made his escape. And Michal took the teraphim and put it in the bed, and put the goat's hair netting at its head, and covered it with the blanket. And Saul sent messengers to see David, but she said,
"He is sick."
But Saul said to the soldiers,
"Bring him up to me in the bed to be put to death."
And when the soldiers went into his house, recognized that, in David's bed only an idol was.
During that time David fled to Ramah to meet with Samuel and tell him all that Saul had done to him. Jonathan and David met in secret, as arranged by David. They vowed to be kind to one another and their families. The new moon feast occurred the following day, and David was expected to eat with the king, but he decided to hide in a field instead. Jonathan agreed to inform David if Saul was still furious and had any plans to kill him. To let David know whether it was okay to stay or required to escape, they set up a covert signal that involved an arrow being shot. After that conversation, David went to the field. When the new moon feast arrived, the king sat down to eat, and noticed that David not was there. But Saul did not said anything about it.
But the next day when David's place at the table was still empty, Saul asked,
"How comes it Jesse's son did not come to the meal either yesterday or today?"
Jonathan gave the excuse he and David had agreed and told his father that David was in Bethlehem with his family making a sacrifice. But Saul's anger flared at Jonathan. "I know you are associated with Jesse's son to bring shame yourself and to your family. As long as he lives you will not become king. Send David to me, so I can kill him."
Why should he be put to death? What has he done?
Jonathan asked. But Saul in his big anger hurled his spear at Jonathan. After that there was no doubt that David's life was in danger.
Jonathan went the field where David was hiding early the next morning. "Run and find the arrows I shoot," he instructed the young child who was accompanying him. The child discharged an arrow past him as he ran. Jonathan called out the covert signal they had created to alert David when the boy arrived at the spot where his arrow had struck. "Is the arrow not past you? Hurry, go, run, don't stop." The youngster went back to his master after picking up the arrow. Jonathan handed the youngster his weapons and instructed him to return to town with them. Following the boy's departure, David emerged from hiding and knelt down in front of Jonathan 3 times, his face lowered to the ground. David cried the hardest as they hugged and kissed one another. David was told to leave in peace by Jonathan since they had made a friendship oath in the Lord's name. "God will always be a witness between us, as well as between our descendants and your descendants." The two friends walked away. Jonathan went back to his house as David left to go into hiding. But what happened later? Saul was trying to kill David to prevent him becoming the next king of Israel. David fled to hide in a large cave at Adullam where his family came to join him. 400 men who were either in distress, in debt, or discontent came to support David. Near to Adullam was the town of Keilah. Philistine raiders were attacking the town to steal grain. When David found out, he asked God whether he should attack the Philistines. The Lord answered,
"Go, attack the Philistines and save Keilah."
Therefore, David and his men inflicted heavy losses on the Philistines and saved the people of Keilah. King Saul was told that David was in Keilah and he thought he had him trapped. David learned that Saul was plotting against him. He asked Abiathar the priest to inquire from God whether Saul would attack Keilah and whether its citizens would hand him over to Saul. The Lord replied that Saul would attack Keilah and David would be handed over to him. So David moved to the wilderness strongholds around Ziph. Saul searched for David but did not find him. While David was at Horesh, Saul's son Jonathan secretly paid David a visit without letting his father know. "Don't be afraid," Jonathan told David. "My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You shall be king over Israel, and I will be second to you." The two made a promise before God and went their ways. The local Ziphites went to Saul at Gibeah to report David was at the hill of Hakilah near Horesh. Saul told them to keep a close watch on David's movements and keep him updated. Saul and his army went down to the desert of Maon where David was last seen. As Saul approached one side of the mountain, David and his men were on the other side hurrying to get away. At the moment Saul was closing in on David, a messenger appeared. "Come quickly, the Philistines are attacking our land." Saul had to break off his pursuit of David to go and fight the Philistines. David and his men escaped to live in the wilderness hills and caves around En-Gedi near the Dead Sea. King Saul fought against the Philistines then. When told that David was in En-Gedi, he returned with 3,000 men to search for David. David and his men were hiding in a cave. King Saul needed to relieve himself and went alone into the cave in which David was hiding. David and his men were hiding far back in the cave. His men whispered, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said, 'I will put your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish.'" David crept up unnoticed on King Saul. Instead of killing Saul, David cut off the edge of his robe without his noticing it. "The Lord forbid that I lay my hands on the king he has anointed," he told his men. And he stopped them attempting to kill Saul. David went out of the cave and called out to Saul,
"My lord the king."
When Saul looked round, David bowed down with his face to the ground.
"The Lord gave you into my hands when you came into the cave and my men wanted to kill you. But I spared your life as you are the Lord's anointed. Look at this piece of your robe I cut off. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May God judge and decide between us. May he deliver me from your hand."
Saul asked,
"Is that you, David?"
and he wept aloud.
"You are better than me,"
he said.
"You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. The Lord gave me into your hands, but you did not kill me."
King Saul told David that he now knew that David would be the next king of Israel. He asked David not to kill his descendants or wipe out his family name when he became king. David promised he would not kill Saul's descendants. King Saul then returned home, but David stayed at En-Gedi. Saul was afraid of what will happen. He wished to make sure the results of the battle. But he made a wrong decision again. Let's see. Samuel the prophet died in his old age and was buried in his hometown of Ramah. Some time afterwards, the Philistines again made war on Israel. The Philistines brought their army to a place near Shunem. King Saul and his army went out to defend their country. They camped on Mount Gilboa, but when Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Saul tried to find out what the Jehovah wanted him to do, but the Lord gave no answer. So Saul foolishly decided to do something that God had strictly forbidden. Visit a medium, a person who claims to be able to speak to the spirits of the dead. Now King Saul has already outlawed all mediums from the land of Israel. But his servant knew that there was a woman living in Endor who was a medium. King Saul put on a disguise and went to see her. Saul said to her, "Speak to the spirits and call up the one I tell you." But the woman, a witch, was suspicious, fearing it was a trap.
"Surely you know that the king has forbidden anyone to do that,"
she said. Saul promised her she would be safe. Then he asked her to call back the spirit of the prophet Samuel. When Saul heard Samuel's voice, he said, "I am in great trouble, Samuel. Tell me what I must do." The spirit, who imitated that he is Samuel, replied,
"As you have disobeyed the Lord, he is giving your kingdom to David. The Philistines will defeat you, and tomorrow you and your sons will die."
Just as Saul heard, the Philistines defeated the Israelites the next day. Many Israelites were killed and the rest fled. The enemy captured Saul's sons, including Jonathan, and killed them. Saul was badly wounded by an arrow. Not wanting to be captured, he asked his armor-bearer to kill him. But the armor-bearer refused. So Saul killed himself by falling on his own sword. The next day the Philistines found the bodies of Saul and his sons. They cut off Saul's head, then nailed his body and the bodies of his sons to the wall of the city of Beth-shan. When the Israelites who lived in Jabesh heard about this, some of their bravest men went to Beth-shan and took down their bodies. They buried King Saul and his sons near a great tree in Jabesh. After David mourned for Saul and Jonathan, he moved to Hebron. The people of Judah came to him there and anointed him as their king. Later he was anointed as king over all the tribes of Israel. David's friends Jonathan had a son, namely Mephibosheth. How David shows kindness to Mephibosheth. When David became king, he remembered the promise he had made to King Saul's son, Jonathan, to show kindness to his family and descendants. Jonathan and Saul had both died in battle against the Philistines. In those days a new ruler would often kill the relatives of a previous king as they might be a threat to his rule. David asked his advisors,
"Is there anyone belonging to Saul's family to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?"
A servant of Saul, called Ziba, was summoned. The king asked Ziba,
"Is there anyone still alive from Saul's family to whom I can show God's kindness?"
Ziba replied,
"There is Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, who is lame in both feet."
Mephibosheth had been a young child at the palace when a messenger ran to announce news of King Saul's death and that the Philistines were coming. His nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became disabled.
"Where is he?"
the king asked. Ziba explained that Mephibosheth was living at Lo-debar. David sent for him. Mephibosheth arrived at the palace in fear, not knowing what David would do to him.
"Don't be afraid,"
David told him,
"for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan."
Mephibosheth bowed and said,
Who am I that you should notice a dead dog like me?
The king summoned Ziba, and said,
"I have given Mephibosheth everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your 15 sons and 20 servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops to provide for him."
David then told Mephibosheth that he would always eat at the king's table with the king's sons and be treated like one of them. From that day all the members of Ziba's household became servants of Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, and always ate at the king's table. David was a talented man. What can we know about him, from the songs, what he created? Let's see. David is well known as the young man who overcame the giant Goliath with a stone from his sling. He was also a talented musician and songwriter. After winning his battle with Goliath, David was invited to play his harp before King Saul, who was calmed by the beautiful music he played. David was skilled in writing songs of praise to God called psalms. They were poems set to music. In the lyrics, David spoke of God's greatness.
"O Lord our God, the majesty and glory of your name fills all the earth and overflows the heavens. You have taught the little children to praise you perfectly. May their example shame and silence your enemies."
When he was young, David cared for his father's sheep. He knew that God would care for him that way.
"The Lord is my shepherd, I have everything I need. Even when walking through the dark valley of death I will not be afraid, for you are close beside me, guiding all the way."
Some songs are prayers of forgiveness.
"O loving and kind God, have mercy. Have pity upon me and take away the awful stain of my sin. Oh, wash me, cleanse me from this guilt. Let me be pure again. Restore to me again the joy of your salvation, and make me willing to obey you. Then I will teach your ways to other sinners, and they, guilty like me, will repent and return to you."
Other psalms are prayers for help or rescue.
"I am in deep trouble. Rush to my aid, for only you can help and save me. O Lord, don't delay."
David often sang about that, how deeply he loves his Creator and his words.
"Jehovah's decisions are true, every one right, they that are more enjoyable than gold, than red gold in abundance, and sweeter than honey and drippings of the comb. By them, too, your servant takes warning. From attention to them come great returns. Missteps who can keep track of? Hold me clear of unnoticed things. From high-handed ways too keep me back, let them not rule me. Then I shall be all right, innocent of great crime. May the words of my mouth and the thoughts of my heart be acceptable before you, Jehovah, my rock and my friend in need."
David wrote and sang many songs of praise and thanksgiving to God.
"I will be glad and rejoice in you. I will sing the praises of your name, O Most High."
After the death of King Saul and Jonathan in battle, David was first anointed king of Judah, then king of all the tribes of Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king. What kind of outstanding act did he make after that? Let's see. For the first 7.5 years of his reign David ruled from Hebron. David then decided to take Jebus, later called Jerusalem, which was held by the Jebusites, as the new capital of his kingdom. Jerusalem, on Mount Zion, had a fortress that was so well defended the Jebusites boasted,
"You will not get in here. Even the blind and the lame can ward you off."
Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion and made Jerusalem the city of David. He started developing the land around the fortress and the Lord was with him in all he did. Hiram, king of Tyre, sent envoys to David, along with cedar logs and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David. David knew that God had established his kingdom and he wanted to make Jerusalem a place of worship too. The Ark of the Covenant had been at the house of Abinadab at Kiriath-Jearim, Bala, for the last 92 years. David wanted to bring it to Jerusalem and put it in a new tabernacle he had erected. The whole of Israel assembled at Kiriath-Jearim, and the Ark of God was put on a new cart with Uzzah and Ahio guiding it. They did not think it was important to obey God's instruction that the ark was only to be moved by the Levites. David and all the Israelites were celebrating with all their might before God, with songs and with harps, lyres, tambourines, cymbals and trumpets. When they came to the threshing floor of Kidon, Uzzah reached out his hand to steady the ark, because the oxen stumbled. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah, and he struck him down because he had put his hand on the ark. He died on the spot. David was afraid and asked,
"How can I ever bring the Ark of God to me?"
The ark was taken to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite, where it stayed for the next 3 months. While the ark was at his house, the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his family. David decided to bring the ark to Jerusalem, but do it the way God had instructed Moses it should be moved. "No one but the Levites may carry the Ark of God," David announced. The Lord chose them to carry the ark and minister before him. When the Levites had carried the ark for 6 steps, David made sacrifices to God. David asked the Levites to choose musicians to make a joyful sound with lyres, harps and cymbals. The musicians were led by Heman, Asaph and Ethan. The Levites were clothed in fine white linen, as was David. Kenaniah was in charge of the choir who led the singing. The people of Israel brought the ark to Jerusalem with shouts of joy and the sound of ram's horns, trumpets, cymbals, lyres and harps. As the Ark of the Covenant was entering Jerusalem, David's wife Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window. When she saw King David dancing and celebrating, she despised him in her heart. They brought the ark and set it inside the tent that David had pitched for it. David sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings and blessed everyone in the name of the Lord. He gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates and a cake of raisins to each person in the crowd. Then everyone returned home. When David went home to his wife Michal, she said,
"Is it right for the king of Israel to behave as any vulgar person would, in the front of the slave girls and servants?"
David replied,
"I was before the Lord who chose me to rule Israel, and I will celebrate before him."
David battles with the Ammonites. King David was told that King Nahash of the Ammonites had died and his son Hanun had succeeded him as king. The Ammonites lived in the kingdom of Ammon to the east of King David's kingdom on the other side of the river Jordan. King Nahash had shown kindness to David, so David sent envoys from Jerusalem to express his sympathy to Hanun. However, when the envoys arrived, King Hanun's commanders warned him. Quote,
"Do you think David is honoring your father by sending envoys to express sympathy? They are only here to spy out the city and overthrow it."
So King Hanun humiliated King David's envoys by shaving off half of each man's beard and cutting off their garments just below the waist. When David heard how his envoys had been humiliated, he told them to stay in Jericho until their beards had grown again. The Ammonites knew David would retaliate, so they hired 33,000 fighting men from the nearby Aramean tribes. These men assembled in the plain outside the city. The Ammonites came out of the city and took up their positions. David sent Joab with his entire army of fighting men into Ammon. Joab split his soldiers into 2 groups, one under his command and the other under the command of his brother Abishai. The best fighters were put in the group to fight the Arameans. The other group faced the Ammonites. Joab then announced,
"Be strong and fight bravely for our people and our God. The Lord will do what is good in his sight."
Joab and the troops with him advanced to fight the Arameans, and they fled before him. Abishai attacked the Ammonites. When the Ammonites realized that the Arameans were fleeing, they fled and went back inside the city. Joab returned to Jerusalem. The Arameans, who had been routed by Israel, then regrouped. They sent messengers beyond the river Euphrates to gather more Aramean troops. Their army gathered at Helam on the border of David's kingdom. King David assembled all his soldiers and headed for Helam to do battle with them. David attacked the Aramean battle lines and they fled before him. David's soldiers killed 700 of their charioteers and 40,000 of their foot soldiers. Shobek, the commander of their army, was struck down and died. When all the kings of the Arameans saw they were defeated, they made peace with the Israelites and became subject to them. They no longer fought for the Ammonites against Israel. Absalom the son of David rebels against his father King David. Why? And what happened after that with him? David had several sons by different wives. Absalom was his third oldest son. David's oldest son was called Ammon. Absalom's mother was the daughter of the king of Geshur. Absalom also had a sister called Tamar. There was big trouble in the family when Ammon raped Tamar. When Absalom found out what had happened to his sister, he plotted revenge. 2 years later, Absalom got his servants to get Ammon drunk and then murdered him. King David mourned many days for his son. Absalom fled to hide in the land of Geshur for the next 3 years. David, although longing to see Absalom again, could not forgive him. Joab, commander of David's armies, tried to resolve the problem by inviting a wise woman to see David. The woman arrived dressed as a widow in mourning clothes.
I had 2 sons,
she explained.
But they got into a fight and one killed the other. Now everyone is saying hand over the son who murdered so we can put him to death for taking the life of his brother. This son is all I have.
Go home and I will issue an order to stop them killing your son,
said David. The wise woman then said,
When the king says this, does he not convict himself, for the king has not brought back his banished son?
David summoned Absalom to come back to Jerusalem, and although he would not see him immediately, he later sent for Absalom. Absalom arrived and bowed face down before his father, who kissed him. Absalom became very proud. He provided himself with chariot and horses and 50 men to run ahead of him. Everyone praised him for his handsome appearance. Absalom was particularly proud of his hair, which he cut once a year. The weight of the cut hair was 200 shekels. Absalom would sit by the city gate to meet those coming to the king for a judgment. He would say,
I can see that you are right in this matter. It is a shame the king doesn't have anyone to assist him in hearing these cases. I wish I were the judge, then anyone with a lawsuit could come to me, and I would give him justice.
And when anyone came to bow to him, Absalom wouldn't let him, but shook his hand instead. So in this way Absalom became very popular with the people of Israel. After 4 years of gaining popularity, Absalom plotted to become king instead of his father David. He went to the king and asked permission to go to Hebron to keep a promise he had made with God to make a sacrifice to him for bringing him back from Geshur. David gave him permission to go. Absalom and 200 of his guests went to Hebron. When he got there, he sent messengers to every part of Israel to announce,
As soon as you hear the trumpets, you will know that Absalom has been crowned in Hebron.
Men started gathering to support Absalom's rebellion. Ahithophel, one of David's trusted counselors, declared his support for Absalom. Absalom and his rebel army started marching towards Jerusalem. A messenger soon arrived in Jerusalem to tell King David,
Against you all Israel has joined Absalom in a conspiracy.
David decided to flee the city with his household and 600 loyal troops. There was deep sadness in the city as the king and his retinue left. David's head and feet were covered as a sign of mourning, and he wept as he walked away. The people with him covered their heads and wept also. When Absalom arrived in Jerusalem, he wondered what to do next. David's former advisor Ahithophel urged him to pursue David while he was weary and discouraged. However, David had left a loyal advisor called Hushai in Jerusalem to give Absalom poor advice. Hushai told Absalom not to pursue David immediately, as he was a great fighter and there were mighty warriors with him. Absalom listened to Hushai's advice, and David had time to make his escape. Ahithophel, publicly shamed when Absalom didn't listen to him, returned to his hometown and killed himself. David made it to Mahanaim, where people brought him provisions. He organized his army under the command of Joab, Abishai and Ittai. They insisted David did not go into battle with them. Absalom and his troops advanced to find David, and battle broke out in the forest of Ephraim. The battle raged throughout the forest and 20,000 men were killed. During the battle, Absalom came across some of David's troops and fled on a mule. As the mule went beneath the thick boughs of a great oak tree, Absalom's hair got caught in the branches. His mule went on, leaving him dangling in the air. One of David's men saw him and told Joab. Joab asked the man why he had not killed Absalom.
We all heard the king say to you and Abishai and Ittai,
For my sake, please don't harm young Absalom.
The soldier replied,
Enough of this nonsense.
Joab replied. Then he took 3 daggers and plunged them into the heart of Absalom as he dangled from the oak. They threw Absalom's body into a deep pit in the forest and piled a great heap of stones over it. Absalom's army fled to their homes. A messenger told David,
Blessed be the Lord, your God, who has destroyed the rebels, who dared to stand against you.
What of young Absalom?
The king demanded.
May all of your enemies be as that young man is.
The messenger replied. Then the king burst into tears, and went up to his room wailing.
Oh my son Absalom, my son Absalom. If only I could have died for you. Oh Absalom, my son, my son.
As people heard of the king's deep grief for his son, the joy of victory was turned into deep sadness. David later returned to Jerusalem to reign as king of Israel once more.
God sent Nathan, who was a prophet, to reveal the seriousness of David's transgression against Uriah the Hittite about Bathsheba, as well as the divine punishment meted out as a result. He handled this with subtlety, but also with firmness, and an example. Chapter 12 of 2 Samuel provides the illustration that Nahum mentioned. Let's see. There were 2 men in a certain city. One was wealthy, but the other was poor. The wealthy man had a very large flock and herd, but the poor man had nothing except a single small ewe lamb that he had acquired. He nourished it and raised it together with himself and his sons. From his crumbs it would eat, from his cup it would drink, and in his arms it would lie. It was like a daughter to him. There came a visitor to the wealthy man, but he was unwilling to take from his own flock or herd to prepare a meal for the wanderer who had come to him. Instead he took the poor man's ewe lamb and prepared food for the wanderer who had come to him. David became very angry because of this man. He said to Nathan, As the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, and because he had no pity. Then Nathan told David, You are this man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. I anointed you as king over Israel, and I rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave to you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and I gave to you the house of Israel and Judah. If this were too little, I would have continued to do for you much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord by doing evil in his sight? You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and you took his wife as a wife for yourself. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now the sword will never depart from your house, because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord. See, I will raise up trouble against you from within your own house. I will take your wives before your eyes and will give them to your neighbor, and he will lie with your wives in broad daylight. Although you did it secretly, I will do this thing before all of Israel and under the sun. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan said to David, Now the Lord has put away your sin, you shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is born to you shall die. The newborn child of Bathsheba and David fell ill after Nathan left for home. David begged God to ensure the child's safety. He fasted and slept on the ground while wearing sackcloth. Soon the baby passed away. The devastating information was delivered to David. He broke his fast and finished his prayers before entering to console his wife and view the infant. Solomon was the name David and Bathsheba gave to their second son, who was born later. The name Jedediah, which means, friend of God, was bestowed upon him by the Lord out of affection for him through the prophet Nathan. Solomon developed into the following king of Israel. In other episode, let's see what we know about Solomon from the Bible.
How became Solomon a king? When King David was old and weak, a carer called Abishag was chosen to look after him. David had many sons by several wives, but had promised Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, that her son would succeed him as king. Another of David's sons, Adonijah, the younger brother of Absalom, saw an opportunity to make himself king instead. He got chariots and horses ready, with 50 men to run ahead of him. Joab, commander of the army, and Abiathar the priest, gave him their support. But Zadok the priest, Benaiah, one of David's mighty men, Nathan the prophet, and David's special guard remained loyal to him. Adonijah went to the stone of Zoheleth near En-Rogel to make sacrifices. He invited all the other princes, except Solomon, to join him. All the royal officials of Judah were invited, but not Nathan the prophet, or Benaiah and David's special guard. When the prophet Nathan learned about the plot, he went to Bathsheba and advised her life and that of Solomon was under threat. Nathan urged her to go to King David and ask,
"Didn't you promise me that Solomon would take over the throne? Why then has Adonijah become king?"
So Bathsheba went to see the aged king and bowed down before him. She told David that Adonijah had declared himself king and Joab and others were supporting him. She pleaded with him to let Israel know who David had chosen to be king. Nathan then arrived to confirm the plot to David. King David gathered Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet and Benaiah and told them to put Solomon on a donkey and take him to the springs at Gihon. When Solomon arrived at Gilhon, Zadok the priest took a horn of scared oil anointed Solomon as king. Then they sounded the trumpet and everyone shouted, "Long live King Solomon!" People played pipes and celebrated so loudly that the ground shook. The noise could be heard further down the Kidron Valley where Adonijah and his rebels were finishing their feast. At first Adonijah thought it must be good news. But then, Jonathan, son of Abiathar the priest arrived to break the news that Zadok and Nathan had declared Solomon was king. Solomon had taken his seat on the royal throne and officials were congratulating him. King David was praising God for allowing him to see his successor on the throne. All Adonijah's guests rose in alarm and ran off. Adonijah, in fear of Solomon, went and took hold of the horns of the altar and pleaded for his life. When Solomon heard about this he said,
"If Adonijah shows himself to be worthy, not a hair of his head will be harmed, but if evil is found in him, he will die."
King Solomon sent men to bring Adonijah down from the altar. Adonijah bowed down before King Solomon, who told him,
"Go to your home."
When David was close to death he told Solomon,
"Be strong and obey God. If you keep his laws you will prosper."
David reminded Solomon of the promise God had made him.
"If you do what is right and are faithful with all your heart and soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne of Israel."
When David died he was buried in Jerusalem, also known as the City of David. Solomon dealt with those who had and supported Adonijah's rebellion and was firmly established as king.